Thank you. Nice to see you all again. I am still in Florida, but I'm heading home today, as we said. So today we're going to talk about models, the many models of grief that have been created over the years. And the goal is not to have you understand a model completely, but just to have a little bit of familiarity with it, because it's out there in books, in grief workshops, and sometimes even in counseling that people get. But before we go there, actually, I was curious if anybody, I told you last time, I never expect adults to do homework, but I offer it always as a way for people to reflect. And if the homework last time was to list 10 to 15 losses that you've had in your life. And I'm in a moment, I'm going to ask if you did it, and if you not, I don't care whether or not you did it. What I want to know about is the insight that you got if you did choose to do it. And I want to share my own to start with. I don't actually want a list of the losses. We don't need to hear about that. But if there was an insight that occurred to you upon reflection, that would be, I think that would be useful for all of us to hear. For me, maybe half of the losses that I wrote down were deaths. But what surprised me and what my insight was about was the losses that happened that were lifestyle related. And I never actually acknowledged them as losses. I never thought that I needed to grieve those. And in looking at them, I realized some of the behaviors that I went through during the time of that loss was probably grief. And I didn't know that it was grief. And some of them I grieve now because I've identified it. So it's like, oh, I am still grieving that one, and that's okay. So anyone else have an insight? Yeah, Agnes.
Yeah, I feel like similarly, since committing to death work and starting to learn about grief over the past year and a half, I have been recognizing a lot of my grief that isn't a loss of a person to death. And I definitely really appreciate you bringing that up and just having that assignment, because I feel like I've had a lot of just questioning and sort of almost imposter syndrome about some of the grief, not wanting it to recognize it as grief in some ways, thinking that that's not valid. But the more that I embrace and recognize how much grief shows up in so many different areas and types of situations in life, it really helps me. I've found so far helps me to process and see how significant those losses really were for me.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead, Judy.
Oh, I was just gonna say I didn't have any trouble coming up with 15 or 20 things. For one thing, which is sort of interesting when you stop and think of, go to, and they aren't, they're mostly not deaths of people. It was more around, I would say, hard choices in life or hard circumstances. And it was interesting to see that. I mean, there have been a chunk of deaths for sure. But also maybe due to my age, I can reflect on a lot of things that were about, lost friendships, lost opportunities, lost, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Kate.
I found, I would say, potential, like finding out that a good friend that I had finally reconnected with had dementia. And so there were no longer the the depth of the conversations. Or another very dear friend had cancer. They thought they got it at Mayo, but as he presented it to me, they've handled it, but I know that this is absolutely terminal because this is the second time cancer has come around. And with my age, understanding that my dear friend down the hall from where I live has had terminal cancer for 4 years, and now it's taking a step to really being terminal. And so it's the potential.
The potential. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna move us on. We'll see if others want to share later. We'll see if we still have time for that. Rhonda, can you do the first slide? I think just a quote that grieving affects us at all levels of our being. It's we know this, that we get it at an intellectual level. Thank you. But it's really important to remember, it's not just emotions. It's physical, it's social, it's everything that's there. And just a reminder. And then I am going to go into the models that we have. So whether or not you've ever heard of John Bowlby, you have likely noticed or experienced some of the stages that he talks about. I've even heard hospice staff say in meetings, she's still numb, that now's not a time to ask her that question. Or we probably all noticed when someone's in that state of disorganization or despair. Bowlby's work and his research, I'm trying to figure out how to be in the sun and still be able to see. I know, first world problem. But Bowlby's work and research was all about maternal attachment. And so the nature of in his theory, the nature of grief depends on the type of attachment that we had with the person who died. So I'll throw that out there. We have, because we all have different levels of knowledge about grief and stages of grief, if there's something you want to add at any point, even if we have to back up, go for it. And then we'll find time at the end for that as well. But I am going to go pretty quickly. So the next slide. And while Strobe and Schutz's model looks pretty complicated on the surface, I think it actually reflects really well the reality of continuing to live after a family member's death, especially if that family member is a partner or a spouse. This actually really helped me understand doing bereavement work with the widow, the young widow of the hospice patient. I've gotten to do work with her almost the last year. And in any conversation, we would zigzag back and forth between something that was new and kind of exciting, and then back to grief and the loss. And it really helped me understand what was going on with her. So, next slide. So this is probably the most talked about model, even by people who are not necessarily talking about death. It gets moved into all kinds of conversations. And the first 5 stages are from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's original work. And then David Kessler added meaning years later with permission from Kubler-Ross and her family. David Kessler knew Elizabeth Kubler-Ross well, and they even wrote a book together. And one of the things he talks about is that the first 5 stages that she talked about are not really about grief. She was studying dying. So these were stages of dying process for her. And then they got shifted into grief somewhere along the way. And what I want to emphasize is an important aspect of this model is that while it's labeled stages, there are no distinct stages. They don't occur in any specific order. They can be collapsed. They can all be jumbled together. They can occur randomly or not at all. some of the stages don't occur at all. I'm someone I am working with right now, was told by a grief counselor she has to go through anger. She said, if you don't go through anger, you're never going to heal. And she said, I'm not sure if that's true. I said, I'm not sure that's true either. I think we each get to have our own journey through grief. The second thing I want to emphasize is that word meaning that David Kessler added. And according to him, meaning comes through finding a way to sustain love for the person after their death while still moving forward in life. It doesn't mean you stop missing the loved one, but it does mean you experience, a heightened awareness of how precious life is. I think some of the people we end up working with equate the pain level that they feel with the love. If I'm feeling love, then I'm feeling pain. And if I let go of the pain, oh my gosh, what if the love disappears too? So they end up maybe staying stuck in the pain. And it's part of our work to help them find meaning in the memories and take that with them into the future. The place I'm staying in Florida is the home of a good friend of mine and his partner. And he lost his wife about 12 years ago. She was one of my best friends. And she died about 12 years ago. And I've gotten to witness him go through all kinds of different things over the years. And this just yesterday, I said to him, you seem like you're in a different place now. How'd you get there? And he said he spends a lot of time, literally, sitting out on this lanai. And he said, I've gone back over our life together. And I have sorted. He said, I look at it as a path, and I've sorted craggy sticks that are on the path that really I don't like to look at, those memories. And then there are these beautiful, budded sticks and different in color. And he said, I sorted them out, and then I gathered all the craggy, ugly ones, and I burned them. In my mind, I burned them. And he said, they're not gone forever. Once in a while, one will pop up, but then I'll remind myself I burned them. I said, that was a brilliant way for you to find the healing that you needed in this. And I asked him if I could share the example, and he said, yeah. So I thought it was real timely, and I appreciated it. So, does anybody want to talk about this one, since this is the one that's out there the most? I'm hearing nothing, seeing no hands. So we'll go on to one more.
I would just like to say,
Oh.
ML, sorry, I was trying to find my
Go for it.
unmute button because it's all
Okay.
over the place, but I just think it's great that you're challenging it and that giving people permission to grieve the way they want to, and not put a recipe on that. I just think that that's awesome to do that, because it makes people, because it really respects the individuality that we want to. I love that you're doing that.
Thank you. David Kessler would even say to us, don't tell people they're grieving the right way, because there is no right way. Just say your journey is going the way it's going. Yeah. Okay, so the next slide. Did someone else? Judy, go ahead. Judy, go ahead.
I know, I had to unmute because it was just your view, so I had to find me, sorry. I was just gonna say, I think we see this really clearly when we deal with a family where there's multiple siblings remaining, and it's sometimes pretty dramatic how different they are from each other in grieving the loss of that parent often, So anyway, I was just gonna say, it made me reflect on cases I've had and how different people do grief.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And I actually want to talk about the difference. Great intro for me. The difference between mourning and grieving. Mourning is what we do on the outside. It's what people can see. Grieving is inside of us. You know, it's a process, it's a journey. It has no dimensions. It has no start and stop. There's no deadline. It's not going to end on a certain date. But we often judge grief by what we see. And so the person crying the most is not necessarily the person grieving the most, because grief is all internal. And so I think that informs us, especially when we have conversations about bereavement assessments. We can't often know what's really going on inside of someone by the mourning behavior that we see on the outside. So I think it's good for us to keep that in mind. And Rhonda, if you can do one more slide, please. If you want, oh, yep, that one. If you want a handy alliterative model, Therese Rando has given us the 6 R's of mourning, and that was why I wanted to talk about mourning. I wanted to talk about number 2 in particular, is where most of what we see as that, all that outward mourning happens. That's where you feel the pain. That's where you're just really dealing with the loss. You start expressing all kinds of things about the loss, and you might even move to accepting the loss in that R of mourning. And again, this is, and while it ends with that reinvesting emotional energy, this can happen anywhere. It's not a linear path. It can happen anytime. And reinvesting the emotional energy means, putting life energy into some new goal or into a new person, or even into ourselves as we're developing. So again, it's not leaving behind whomever it is we're grieving, but it's grieving and living at the same time. And the last one is, yep, you had it. One more, the last, yeah, that model. Yeah, this, it's a model about complicated grief, and we don't often know the backgrounds of the people with whom we get to do bereavement. I mean, we might get to learn it. We don't know about their childhoods always, but this theory is that some people are lucky enough to grow up with a secure childhood, and they still will experience acute grief, and before they can integrate that loss into their life. Other people who are not so fortunate and who grow up without a secure childhood might experience severe distress rather than just acute grief. So for those of us working with folks, we might have to work our way backward to even understand what's going on for someone. And I suspect we've all ended up with someone who's having a harder time than other people, and we don't always know why. This could be a theory about why. So that ends my mini lecture on these models. We're going to do something else, but I want to see if anybody wants to add anything, reflect on it themselves, ask questions. Is that Wendy?
Hi. One of the things that I've thought for a long
Okay, Wendy froze for me. Did she freeze for everybody?
distinction between mourning, grieving. Oh,
So Wendy, most of your comment was frozen, so I don't know that we got it. And you're freezing and unfreezing, so it sounded like you wanted to talk about that distinction between mourning and grieving. So
yeah. Let's see.
you're good right now. So Doesn't look like it is. Someone else?
Wendy,
Hello.
maybe what you could do if you can hear me is type your comment in the chat box because you're freezing.
Good idea.
Better now. I changed my internet source. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's definitely better.
Yeah, CenturyLink. I really like the distinction between grieving and mourning. And I've often felt that this country has discarded virtually every single signal of mourning. We get our 1 or 2 days off for a funeral, and then you're expected to say, I'm fine. And oh, of course it was sad. And pretty soon the will is going to be read. And we don't wear black to funerals. We don't have any community signals of mourning. And I've spent a lot of time in Greece, and they're changing too toward us, just like they're eating our food. But you always knew who was in mourning because they wore black for at least a year. And I'm not advocating that women who are widows should wear black for the rest of their lives, which might be a little bit too intense of a social norm. But I can't think of a single mourning social norm that we have, a visible signal to our community to treat us gently.
Jewish people do the tearing and wear a torn piece of cloth or tear their cloth. And that's still, as my understanding, that's still going on. Is that right? Jewish people?
Yeah, I mean, Judaism has a very clear prescribed way to approach mourning and grieving. So, there's a death. There usually people are buried pretty quickly. There's 7 days it's divided into the 7-day period of Shiva, which the community is supposed to provide for you meals and support. Okay, immediate. You're in very strict Judaism. You don't go to work. You don't do anything. You don't socialize, whatever. So it gives you this like respite to say, let it all out, go for it. Then there's a period called Shloshim, which means 30 days. And in that 30 days, you might, some people might, go back to work, or they might do some things that they have to do, but they aren't socializing, so it's a gradual thing. You're still partly removed from the world. And then really it's a whole year. So, it's kind of a beautifully, I think, designed system of, if you, agree with it or buy into it, that it's a whole process of how one lets go. And then there's a yearly reminder of the death of that person called a yard site, in which you remember that person. So, yeah, I mean, anyway, so that's there. And I had another comment, but I can't remember it. So
Thank you. So other comments either about that or one of the models? Yeah, Aggie.
Oh, I know what my question was. I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead, Aggie. I'll write it down so I remember.
I was two quick things. So in relation to what Wendy was saying, I was listening to a podcast. I listened to 2 death-related podcast episodes in the same day. So if anyone's interested, I can definitely figure out which one this was. But someone was being interviewed, and I believe she was either a death doula or a death photographer. And she was asked the question, like, it used to be that people were around death so much more often for obvious reasons. And the person interviewing her was like, do you think that people were just actually a lot more numb to grief, and that like it just was something that became so normal that it was like whatever? And she was like, actually, I think that we had more symbols of when people were mourning publicly, and that it was just understood way more by people in general because they had to face it so much more regularly. And I thought that was a really like beautiful answer to that. And I also have been thinking about since then, like she was like, it would be awesome if we like found new symbols, like even having like bracelets or shirts that said something about like that signaled like I'm grieving. And I'm like, that would be beautiful. I would love to think of more, at least even like personal ritual, sort of something that can notify that like I share with my community, so that like it's something that everyone knows. We can have like little hints without having to always have to like, you know, verbalize it, which I think could be so helpful for a community at large to like have more of that. And then just one other thought that I'm sure we'll probably talk about more at some point, but I'm curious. I've been thinking a lot about like delayed grief, and like delayed grief related to like traumatic deaths and sudden death sort of things.
Yeah, we will talk about that a little bit more later. I do think I totally agree with where the discussion has gone. I think we also have to request it sometimes. We have to be willing to say, I'm grieving. I'm still grieving my sister, folks. So sometimes I'm tender. I really have tender moments, and I don't know when they're going to come, but that's where I'm at right now. So, any other comments?
I remembered my question or my thing. It was talking about the complicated grief. So this little model that you show us is pretty strongly about what happened in your childhood. But it seems to me I've encountered a lot of cases where complicated grief is not so much about your own beginning, but about the relationships and the complications of those relationships, for a better word, of later life, meaning couples or, you know, partners, yep. Or a parent and a child, you know, the estrangement that people can have, or sibling with sibling, or, you know, so I get I get the model you showed, and I think it's probably quite true for many people, but I guess I also feel like a lot goes on in a life and it isn't all related to our childhood. You know, it really is related to us as grown-ups.
I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years with scientists and engineers and computer folks, and I would often, and what I'm working with them on is how to work together. And I would say the most complicated, absolute most complicated piece of equipment you will ever encounter is that person standing in front of you at any given moment. You know, that we're just all very complicated. And so that, I agree with you. It's a simple model, but we're all relationships have some complications too. Anything else anyone wants to add? I did appreciate the chat, a resource that someone, I didn't even notice who put in the chat. Thank you. We're gonna, Rhonda's gonna put us in groups, but there's one more slide that we might need to see unless you have the handout in front of you. It's a slide about myths of grief, common myths about grief. So yeah, the next one. Yeah. So do a quick read through that on the slide or in front of you in your handout. And then we're going to create breakout groups and choose one of those. Each of you individually choose one of those myths that you've witnessed, either in yourself or in families that you've worked with. And take 1 minute per person and just give the example of how that myth played out. And then, so we'll do a breakout group for about 5 minutes and then come back together. So, are you close to ready? I'll give you, let's head and do 1 more minute of looking at those myths. Okay. Rhonda, are you ready to put us in groups?
Okay, how would you like me to do that?
You can stop the screen share in groups of 4 or 5, however.
Okay, and do you want me to assign people or do you want people to choose their rooms?
whatever's easiest. We can be anywhere.
Okay,
we
I'm just
want.
gonna assign automatically, okay?
Right.
That'll be the easiest, and I'm gonna create, how many rooms shall I create? 4 maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. Move to room 3. Here we go.
Yeah.
Shit. Okay, you have to be quiet. Bill? I know you're talking loud and I can't, I'm meeting.
Yeah.
ML showed us a list of common myths with regards to